Okay, today we're going to talk about the immune system, also the lymphatic system and how it works. So, got our wonderful little penguin friend fighting the enemy within. Talk about all these things. First off, what is the lymphatic system? It's a network of vessels that conduct lymph, which is a clear, watery fluid formed from the interstitial fluid. And then we have our lymph vessels that run along the routes of the blood vessels. And that plays a really important role in fluid homeostasis, so keeping things at an even keel. So there's your lymph system. It has the production and transportation of leukocytes and also helps to trap foreign invaders. So it's kind of like your defense mechanism. We have lymph vessels, you can see them right here. They're intertwined amongst the blood vessels, so they're right alongside them. And then here's kind of what a lymph node looks like. See, there's lymphocytes and macrophages, and so we're going to talk about what those do. Alright, then the lymphatic system, it has three functions. One is to collect, filter, and return fluid to the blood through contraction of the muscles. So we're not going to talk about that one any further other than that point right there. It also fights infection using lymphocyte cells, which are found in the lymph nodes. And then finally, it removes excess fluid from body tissue by the same process as number one, collecting, filtering, and returning fluid. Alright, so lymph nodes. What are lymph nodes? We're going to focus on the defense system portion of the lymphatic system and how it contributes to the immune system. So lymph nodes are a mass of tissue that are along a lymph vessel, and they contain a large number of lymphocytes, which are white blood cells. Those lymphocytes fight infection, so they'll come in contact with an antigen, which is just a foreign substance, something it doesn't recognize. It's not necessarily something harmful, but it's something foreign. Then they multiply rapidly, which is why your lymph nodes swell. So if you are sick and go to the doctor and they check for your lymph nodes being swollen, that is a sign of an infection. Alright, so why do we have an immune system? Well, first off, it is a two-tiered defense system. We have non-specific and specific defense systems. So you can have attacks from the outside, such as viruses, bacteria, anything like that, and also attacks from the inside, like cancer cells. In general, it is a closely coordinated system of specialized cells. So it's got some cells that have very specific jobs, and they know exactly what to do when something foreign comes into the body. So antigens, again, are foreign molecules that trigger a response, some sort of response, and then stimulates production of antibodies to eliminate that foreign factor. Right, non-specific immunity is the non-specific prevention of entrance of invaders into the body. So it keeps them out. It's not necessarily attacking and killing them, but it's keeping them out. So a couple examples of that are saliva has lysosome in it, and that kills germs before they take hold. You also have that in tears. Skin is a physical barrier, right? Things can't necessarily get in unless you have open wounds. And then the mucus lining your trachea and your lungs surrounds and engulfs bacteria, and then it gets rid of the mucus, and the bacteria can't infect you. Finally, remember how the stomach is incredibly acidic? Well, that acidity kills bacteria in the stomach. So those are all non-specific systems. So that acid in the stomach doesn't say, hey, there's bacteria, I'm going to kill it. It just is acidic, so it kills bacteria. Alright, some parts of the non-specific immunity system are phagocytes. They engulf antigens, those foreign objects. Also things like bacteria and dead cells. So they are kind of our trash compactors. Alright, we also have complement proteins. So they break down the cell wall of an antigen and then coat those antigens that tell phagocytes to engulf them. They say, hey, over here, eat this thing. And then interferons inhibit viral replication and activate cells that have antiviral actions. So they say, you can't replicate anymore, and then they go get something that'll come get rid of the virus. And finally, inflammatory response, a series of events that respond to an antigen invasion or a physical injury. And we'll talk about that series of events. So these, you might say, well, these are specific. They're specifically going after these things. But they aren't really, and we'll talk about why that is right now. So, leukocytes are those phagocytic white blood cells, and they're attracted by those chemical signals released by damaged cells. So a cell gets damaged, sends off a signal, and it says, hey, I'll come eat whatever it is that you need me to eat. So it comes into the infected tissue and ingests microbes. The reason it's non-specific is because it's just looking for something to eat. It doesn't have a vendetta against anything there. It just is hungry and wants to eat the things. All right, so a couple examples of those are neutrophils. They are the most abundant white blood cell. They've got a 3-day lifespan. Then we have macrophages. They're what we consider a big eater, and they are very long-lived. Then finally, we have natural killer cells. So they destroy virus-infected cells and cancer cells. All right, so that was the phagocytes and what they do. So now we've got our inflammatory response. So let's say you got a splinter in your finger. That damage to your tissue triggers this local non-specific inflammatory response. So it releases histamines and prostaglandins. So it gives off this chemical signal. That signals the phagocyte, says, hey, come eat something. And then the capillaries dilate so that it's more permeable, which increases blood supply, so that's why it gets kind of red and swollen and hot right around there. And then the phagocytes come in and they eat the foreign material. So here you go, something comes in, sends off the chemical alarm, out come our white blood cells, and here they come to clean up the infection. It swells for a bit as it's cleaning it up, and then they munch on all of the foreign antigens, and then they go back to where they came from, and now it is gone down in swelling. All right, so now the specific response. So those ones are non-specific. They're just things that happen. Our specific response system, we've got lymphocytes. So we have B cells and T cells are the main ones. We also have antibodies, which have different types of immunoglobulins. And they also respond to antigens, foreign things in the body, such as pathogens, which cause disease, or toxins, or even abnormal body cells like cancer cells. So how do we recognize those invaders, those antigens? Well, those antigens come in and they've got proteins that serve as name tags almost. Hello, my name is foreign. Right, so the foreign antigens cause a response from the white blood cells. They could be anything like viruses, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, toxins. It could also be something like pollen or a transplant, like an organ donation or a tissue donation, or even a blood transfusion. So anything like that would be a foreign object. So those B cells and T cells respond to different antigens. The B cells recognize intact antigens. So those would be pathogens that are in the blood and the lymph, that fluid. And then T cells recognize antigen fragments. So those are when the pathogens have already infected the cells. So here, this one looks like self, and then this one has a different signal, so it's foreign. Not necessarily harmful, but foreign. B cells. So we're going to talk about B and T cells. First off, B cells mature in the bone marrow, and they come from stem cells. And they are a humoral response because they occur in fluid, which we call the humors. Then they defend against those attackers that are circulating freely in the blood and lymph. So they don't go after the cells, they're just in the fluid. When they are causing that defense, they activate and they go into mitosis and create either plasma cells or memory cells. So the plasma cells cause that immediate production of antibodies, and then the antibodies will immobilize and mark the antigen for destruction by the phagocytes. So that's a humoral immunity because it's now floating around in the fluid, in the interstitial fluid. The B cells can also turn into memory cells, which cause our long-term immunity. And what it does is it remembers, hey, this is what it looks like, this is the type of antibody you produce, and then those memory cells stay out there with that information. So if it ever comes in again, it can all of a sudden produce more antibodies than that primary response. So that's our secondary immune response. And it creates significantly more antibodies in a shorter period of time, so it's able to fight it faster, more effectively. So that's how you end up with, your immunity to diseases. All right, so here's our B cell immune response. Invader comes in, tested by the B cells. It's in the blood and lymph, not inside a cell. Here are your B cells with their antibodies, and then they recognize it. They say, hey, this thing's not quite right. So it clones itself. Thousands of clone cells. Says, let's make lots of us. Seeing how this green one says, hey, I know you. So, clones itself. Some of them are memory cells, so they're reserves. They just take in the information and remember it. And then the other ones turn into plasma cells where they release the antibodies, these little Y-shaped objects. So the antibodies go and they attack. They attack the invader and they capture it. And then they can mark it for the phagocytes. Then phagocytes will come and destroy and engulf this antigen. All right, so what are antibodies specifically? They are proteins that bind to a specific antigen. So they're these multi-chain proteins that the B cells make, and they've got a binding region that will match the molecular shape of the antigen. So each antibody is unique and specific, and there are millions of antibodies that can respond to millions of foreign antigens. So they're kind of like handcuffs. This is foreign, stay right here. So it kind of immobilizes it and then marks it for destruction. So you can kind of see here's your places that it would bind with these different shaped objects. Alright, so there are millions of antibodies and there are several different classes, specifically 5 classes of the immunoglobulins. So here's this one. It's got the first immune response where it activates those complement proteins that tag it for destruction by the phagocytes. Then this one is where you get the second response. So there's a major antibody that's circulating in the plasma, and that promotes phagocytosis by macrophages. Then there's also IgA, which is in external secretions like sweat or mother's milk. Then IgE promotes release of histamine and a lot of bodily fluids, and that's a reaction to parasites. What it usually does is it triggers an allergic reaction. And then IgD are receptors of B cells. So here is where you can see this first response, and here's the second response. So once you get those memory cells from this first encounter with the antigen, then the memory cells the second time are going to be, you're going to get increased levels of antibodies over time. And they'll stick around so that they can attack it faster and get rid of it faster the next time. Alright, so T cells, they mature in the thymus. So B cells mature in the bone marrow, and T cells mature in the thymus. So that's a direct cellular response to infected cells. It's what we're going to call a cell-mediated response. So once they're activated, they start cloning themselves, same as the B cells. And their immune response is to infected cells, not to antigens floating around in the fluid, but is cells that have already been infected. So they defend against non-self cells, like cancer or even transplant cells. The types of T cells that they clone themselves into are memory T cells, helper T cells, so they alert the immune system. They run off to say, hey, come over here. And also killer or cytotoxic T cells, which attack the infected body cells. So these guys remember, these guys help and alert people, and these guys actually attack the cells. So how do cells get tagged with antigens? Well, we have major histocompatibility proteins called MHC, and they distinguish between self and foreign cells. So MHC proteins constantly carry bits of cellular material from the cytosol to the surface. So it gives the cell a fingerprint. So here you can see, how do you know it's infected? Well, they'll digest pathogens and MHC proteins, bind and carry pieces of the cell surface, so they present these infected proteins. Right, I'll do another section.